My name is Mike Bontempo. I'm the treasurer for the Friends of the Milford Town Library. I'd like to welcome you tonight to this evening's program with Joanna Schaffhausen. If anybody has a cell phone or digital device, make sure it's turned off. The Friends are a non-profit corporation. We were founded in 1977. We raise funds to support library materials such as museum passes and special acquisitions for the current historical collection, and programming for adults, young adults, and children. This year, the Friends have undertaken our most ambitious project yet to date, and that's the renovation of the Leonard Allen Hill Memorial Park and Garden. That's the empty space you see out there in between the parking lot and the library. That's supposed to be a garden, and we're renovating that. So we appreciate any support that you can give us. Forms to donate to the renovation project are upstairs. As you walk out, there's a little display of what the garden will look like. Hopefully, construction is going to start this month. There's also little forms that you can take. So just remember, the best way to support the library is to use it. Is what we're doing tonight. And the second best way to support the library is to become or help out the Friends. Just want to mention two upcoming programs. Next Wednesday, June 19th at 7 p.m., we have Peking in the Mystics. We'll present a program entitled Vintage Vocals, a dynamic a cappella group comprised of 5 Tufts University graduates who are all members of the university's acclaimed singing group, the Beelzebubs. Peking and the Mystics have been singing wonderful harmonies since 1973. The group's eclectic a cappella repertoire, made up of original arrangements by the members themselves, incorporates swing, jazz, doo-wop, and popular music of every decade from the 1890s to the 2000s. Again, that's next Wednesday here at 7 p.m. And then on Wednesday, June 26th at 7 p.m., we have singer Les Sampu. Will bring her mix of Americana, blues, and country music. Les has a powerful, emotional vocalist in the tradition of Lucinda Williams, Bonnie Raitt, and Rory Block. Les has been chosen as a critical support act for such legends as Aretha Franklin, Richard Thompson, Nancy and Ann Wilson of Heart, Pat Benatar, Johnny Lang, and Sugarland. Les will present a repertoire of original music, of country, blues music, heartfelt ballads, and select favorites interspersed with her trademark stories in the coffee house style. Again, that's Wednesday, June 26th at 7 p.m. And for this evening's program, Joanna Schaffhausen wields a mean scalpel. Sharp skills she developed in a year studying neuroscience. She has a doctorate in psychology, which reflects her long-standing interest in the brain, how it develops, and the many ways it can go wrong. Previously, she worked as a scientific editor in the field of drug development. Prior to that, she was an editorial producer for ABC News, writing for such programs as World News Tonight, Good Morning America in 2020. Winner of the Mystery Writers of America St. Martin's Minotaur First Crime Novel Award in 2016. Joanna lives in the Boston area with her husband and daughter. So would you please welcome Joanna.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for coming on this, the night of Game 7. I really appreciate it. I'm here to talk primarily about arson this evening, but I will back up just a little bit and say how we got to the arson for those of you who didn't hear me last year and aren't familiar with the books and what they're all about. So the first book was The Vanishing season, and that's the one that won the publishing lottery, and it was like the little, good fairy came along and said, and you shall be published. And I got to skip a whole bunch of steps, which was great in many ways. And that came out in 2017, and it is about 2 main characters, Ellery Hathaway, who was abducted by a very vicious serial killer on the eve of her 14th birthday on the streets of Chicago by a killer who cuts off people's hands. And she would have been victim number 17, except a very green FBI agent at the time, Reed Markham, played a hunch and rescued her from the killer's closet.
Don't tell us anymore.
Okay. Well, that's all the history. That's not even in any of the books. That's just all the backstory. And the first book, Ellery and Reed are reunited when she is an adult, and he is a famous profiler who made his bones on the back of this case. He wrote a best-selling book about it, and he's always told himself he's the big hero of her story, and in reuniting he gets to discover whether that's really true. And then in the second book, No Mercy, which is what I'm principally here to talk about tonight, following the events of the Vanishing season, Ellery is sentenced to group therapy for victims of violent crime. And as you can imagine, Ellery is not keen to talk about her feelings, but also she doesn't think any of these ordinary crime victims have anything to teach her. I mean, they're like victim of a mugging, and her serial killer is like a Jeopardy answer. There's like movies made about her story. She gets to turn on the TV and see who's playing her this week. It's like Ted Bundy, essentially, is the basis for her kind of serial killer. There's a new Ted Bundy story all the time. Excuse me, there was a new one just this year. Zac Efron was playing him or something, and a new documentary on Netflix, and we're just constantly resurrecting Ted Bundy. So you can imagine there's one of his victims who Ellery is very loosely based on, just sort of the concept, who was a teenager at the time that Bundy abducted her. Her name's Carol Durant. And here it is, more than 40 years later. Bundy's been dead for 20 years, and poor Carol still gets 15 messages a day from people who want to know about Bundy, pretend to be victims. The story never goes away. Carol can turn on the TV and see who's playing her because she's a key figure in his story. So every time his story gets told, so does hers. And so she gets sort of trapped in this endless loop of, you know, Ted Bundy. He took over her life at age 18, and she's never really completely gotten it back. And so Ellery, in my books, is kind of like Carol. She survived this serial killer, but he still follows her around in a way. And so now she's in group therapy. She's supposed to be emoting and talking about her story, but her story's been told so many times, she doesn't feel like there's any point in rehashing it, and she's not going to gain anything from sitting around and singing Kumbaya with other people who've been victims. So what she does, instead of this, is to start investigating the crimes that the other people are victims of, because some of them are unsolved. And one of them is theoretically solved. It's an arson story, and a woman in the group named Myra was in a fire 25 years ago that took the life of her toddler son in the family's furniture store, and she was very badly burned. And Ellery starts thinking she may have fingered the wrong guy. And so that's one of the main lines of investigation in the story. So to do the story, I had to do a lot of research on arson. And one of the things I found after doing a lot of research on serial killers for the first book is that a lot of serial killers are also arsonists, and that arsonists and serial killers have a lot of commonalities. And some of them start with arson, and some of them just have like a side job as arsonists. You know, when they're not killing, they just set some fires. When they arrested David Berkowitz, son of Sam, they arrested him for murder, but they found among all of his effects this fire log of various fires he had set, hundreds of them. And they thought, well, this is just a fantasy that he made up. But then they started cross-referencing his names and dates and locations with fires that they had fought in New York City. And it turns out, no, they had a very active arsonist in their midst, and they didn't even know it until they discovered this after they arrested him for murder. So like serial killers, arsonists, and this is people who set fire for fun, not people who set fire to like collect insurance money. They're principally male, up to 95% in some estimates. They're often responsible for dozens of fires, if not more. And they have a lot of psychological commonalities with serial killers. So there's something about the antisocial personality where it's like, oh, I'll just recreationally go out and kill someone just for fun. It's like, well, I'll go out and destroy a building just for fun. There's something about the destructive nature that appeals to these people. They often have troubled relationships, sometimes abuse in their past, substance abuse. These are all commonalities. So here are just a few pretty wild arson tales that I discovered in my research. Excuse me. My allergies have been driving me crazy this week. All the plants having sex, can they stop it now? Oof. In the early 90s, Seattle started burning up. Just dozens of fires, and some of them very close together. And so they figured out pretty quickly that they were dealing with an arsonist, but they couldn't seem to catch him. He was like a ghost. Like they would, drive up very quickly after the fire broke out, but nobody there. And so they called in the FBI, and they said, can you help us? We're trying to catch this arsonist. And as this was happening, more fires, including one at an old folks' home that unfortunately killed several people. They couldn't get out in time. So meanwhile, the FBI is working on this profile because he's very dangerous. People have already died. We want to, catch him before he kills more people. And so they made a detailed profile of him, and they ran it in the paper. And this case is interesting to me because it's one of the few times that I'm aware of that a profile actually caught somebody. Most of the time, the profile looks good, kind of in hindsight. We're like, oh yeah, when we caught the guy, this is definitely who he was, but it didn't actually help you get him. And I touched on this last time. The profilers come in and they offer all these insights, which are helpful, but the police who are sitting there receiving this from the FBI don't often find it very helpful. They're like, okay, so he wet the bed as a kid. All right. How do we go arrest that guy? Like we go door to door. Are there any bedwetters here? Like knock, knock, knock. It doesn't help. Like he has trouble with, troubled relationships with women. Yeah, we got that from the part where he was killing them. We already knew. So they don't find the insights all that helpful very often. But in this case, it was helpful. And this is one of the ways it is helpful. So they ran it in the paper, and the people who do know the arsonist or the killer read it. And a man named George Keller opened the paper, and George had several children, one of whom was named Paul. And Paul was very troubled from a young age. He got into trouble in school, he slacked off, he seemed to be smart, but he never lived up to his potential. He fought with people a lot. He was very interested in fire. And at one point he tried to kill his sister. And so the family was, very nice, middle class, well-meaning, religious family. They knew their son was in trouble. They took him to the doctor. The doctor said, he has ADHD. And they're like, we think it could be more than that. But they had just no experience with this. This is like in the 70s. They're like, we don't know. They gave him medication. They took him to different doctors. Sometimes he seemed to be a little better, others not so much. So with this history, George Keller opens the paper and he sees the FBI profile. And he starts going through the checklist. He says, I'm going to find the part that isn't Paul. And he's reading and he's like, okay, white male in his late 20s, well, that's Paul. And they're like, well, history of substance abuse. Paul was an alcoholic. Yep, all right. Troubled relationships, especially with women. Yep. Smart, but an underachiever. Well, yeah. And had long history with fascination with fire. Yep, also Paul. And then the kicker. The FBI said he's probably a salesman or a delivery man because he knows the streets of Seattle and the surrounding areas so well that he can get in and out before any of the cops or the firefighters arrive, even then he's setting fires in a very close proximity. Excuse me. And it turns out Paul was a salesman in the family business. So there's his dad. There was also a picture, a sketch, because at the fire that killed several people, a witness saw a man there who was behaving oddly, and they thought this could be the arsonist. So they had this sketch accompanying all of the things, and the sketch looked a lot like Paul. So now you're Paul's dad. You love him, you've tried to help him for years, you think he could be a serial arsonist who's killed people. What do? Do you turn in your son? This is what he did. He called him up and said, I think it's my son. And he collected $25,000 for turning in his son, but he gave the money to an Episcopal church that Paul had burned down. This is another sort of clue that was obvious in hindsight. The family is very religious, and they were Episcopalians, and the arsonist, among other targets, burned down several Episcopalian churches. He's in jail today. He was eventually convicted of he confessed to 76 fires, but they think there could be more. He's in prison. He will be for the rest of his life. His parents still love him. You know, he's their boy. They visit him. The dad still feels guilty about turning him in, but he knew he had to because he was, you know, trying to kill people. So, but I can't imagine being faced with that. And this is one of the other commonalities that I find most frightening personally between some serial killers and an arsonist. Paul was born this way. He was like born bad or missing a conscience or whatever. Everybody else in the family, totally normal. There was no abuse. He had loving parents. He just came out with this urge to set things on fire. And as a parent, I can't imagine anything worse, where you have all these hopes and dreams for your child, and you think you're going to bring them into the world and raise them to be a good person and a contributor to society, and instead they go forth and do evil. I can't imagine what that must be like. Come on, slides. So the next story is possibly the craziest arson story in the history of arson stories. And this is from the 80s and 90s in LA County, where they were dealing with lots of fires. But the first signal that they really had something wrong, potentially, was a very serious fire that broke out in like a hardware store, home goods store, hardware store, like Ace Hardware or Home Goods, something in that. It's called Ole's Home Store or Home Goods, something like that. And it went up, and it went so fast that 4 people died. 2 employees and a grandmother and a grandson. And the arriving arson investigators looked at it and they said, well, this was an accident. There are a lot of flammable things in a hardware store. So you get an electric fire that, you know, goes bad, and all of a sudden you get a flash effect and the whole place goes up. But among the people who showed up was an arson investigator from Glendale named John Orr. And he said, no, this is arson. And all the other people were like, we don't think so, John. You're leaping. It's not arson. Well, a few weeks later, another home goods store went up in pretty much just the same way, like in the middle of the day. And now they're like, okay, maybe John has a point. It could be an arsonist. And over the next several years, like, LA burned, and its surrounding towns, just hundreds of fires, but especially fires set in businesses during the day that were open. And the first break they got was a bunch of fires set in Fresno. Again, rapidly during the day, where they're like fighting several at once in businesses. And one investigator was named Marvin Casey. He said, you know what, I think we definitely have an arsonist here. And they got kind of lucky. One of the fires failed to take off. Like, they caught it when it was just smoking, and they saw the device that the arsonist was using to set these fires. And it turned out to be pretty simple, actually. It was a cigarette, couple matches, rubber band, and like a yellow legal paper. And what he would do is he would light the cigarette and, you know, wrap it up with the matches and shove it into a pillow, basically, or styrofoam, something in these stores, because they were all craft stores, home stores, this kind of thing. And then the cigarette would burn down, ignite the matches that would then burn the pillow surrounding them, and it caused the fire. Only here, the cigarette didn't burn all the way. And it didn't ignite the matches. So they were able to see the incendiary device, and more than that, they got a fingerprint off of it. And so Marvin Casey's like, this is going to be the key to the case. And he's looking around, he says, you know what? All these fires are right around where there was an arson investigators conference. What if our arsonist is a firefighter? He's one of us. And he looked at all the people who were there, and he looked at men who traveled alone to the conference from, and would be going home the direction that the fires were in. And he came up with 76 names. And if there's a theme to this story, it's sort of cops versus firefighters. Now, they're all on the same side, but cops are just a little jealous of all the love the firefighters get. Everybody loves a firefighter. Firefighters, when they show up, it's great. You know, you're having some trouble, they come, they help you, it's wonderful. They rescue kittens from trees, it's fabulous. Cops are suspicious. Like, if you're in trouble, you want a cop to come. But other than that, they're pulling you over for speeding or missing the stop sign. They're asking you questions you don't really want an answer to. So they kind of have their own lanes, the cops and the firefighters. So John Orr, the investigator who was called it as arson from the get-go, had initially wanted to be a cop. He applied to the LAPD and was turned down. But he wanted to be a cop so bad, he'd go out on his own. Like, he's driving with his Cadillac around town, just hoping to spot some crime that he could pull over, leap out, and stop. He was nutty like that. He was determined to, solve some crime. And so he ended up in this middle ground of the arson investigator, who was neither cop nor firefighter exactly. And Marvin Casey was similar. And so he went to the investigators on this case and said, we have the fingerprint, we've got this conference, why don't we run the names? And they said, how many names you got? And he goes, 76. And they said, no way. We are not going to go around and accuse 76 high-ranking fire officials of arson based on your hunch. Go away, Marvin Casey. You are not a cop. You're a firefighter. So Marvin Casey went away. And about a year later, there was another arson investigators conference. So the original one was in Bakersfield, now it's in Fresno. And all of a sudden after the conference, lots of fires in businesses during the day. And Marvin Casey was watching. And he's like, we're gonna cross-reference who was at both of these, because he had not given up on his theory despite everybody laughing at him. And he found 10 names that were in common who'd been at both of these conferences. And so he went back to the cops and he said, it's down to 10 names. Can we run 10 names? And they said, if it'll make you go away, Marvin, we will run the 10 names. So they ran the 10 names, no match. And they said, ha, see? You think you're playing cop, but you're just a dumb firefighter. Go away. So Marvin went away. Meanwhile, fires everywhere, threatening homes. They were both in businesses and in surrounding counties, in the wildfires. And every time John Orr would roll up, and he was famous for being able to discover the point of origin right away. He'd come rolling up. Sometimes he'd beat the trucks there. And he'd scent the air like a hound and be like, it's this way. And he'd go right to it. And they're like, yep, he found it again. So the feds now, because all of these different counties and areas had come together and realized we're all dealing with the same thing. And the ATF got involved. And when the feds got involved, they said, what's this theory Marvin has? And they went back to him out in his Bakersfield, and they said, oh, you got that fingerprint, huh? And he's like, yep. We're very interested in your theory. We're going to run that print again. So they ran it again, and it came back to John Orr. And they went back, and I couldn't believe it, because he was so famous. I mean, he's the guy giving the big, the keynote address at these conferences, right? And they went back to Marvin, and they thought maybe John had been helping out at the scene, and that's how his print got there. They said, did any firefighters help you out at these scenes? He goes, no, it was pretty much just my guys. Everybody was on vacation. It was terrible. I said, interesting. So then they put John Orr under surveillance, which is my favorite part of the whole story, because John Orr drives like a bat out of hell. Pedal to the metal, 90 miles an hour up the freeway, weaving in and out of traffic. You cannot tail a guy like that. That's just his natural driving. He's a maniac. But you can't do it too, because you immediately call attention to yourself. So they had to put like an old-fashioned, this is before GPS, like, you know, radio unit on his car, like duct taped under, you know, near the tire. And he caught onto it immediately. He drove back. He's like, somebody's attached a bomb to my car. So they were reduced to doing the best surveillance they could, and they were terrified that he was going to go out and kill somebody before, you know, more people before they could catch him. But all they had was this fingerprint. And eventually they had to arrest him. So they did, and John actually provided some of the most damning evidence himself. He wrote a book about an arsonist who was an arson investigator. And it was a book about him and all the fires he set, including the one where the 4 people died at the arson store, and about how nobody believed the arson investigator when he said it was arson, so he had to set another fire a few weeks later to convince people it was arson. And, you know, a grandmother and a grandchild died, and all, I mean, it was crazy. How many fires did John Orr set? He set so many fires that when they arrested him, the fire rate in LA County dropped to 90%. One guy was responsible for 90% of the fires. They estimate that he set over 2,000 in his career. This is stuff you almost can't make up, right? So that's John Orr, and one of the things that I love about it is, first of all, the LAPD was correct. He flunked that psychological profile and should not have been a cop. And 2, excuse me, it wasn't a cop who got him. It was a firefighter.
He still says he's innocent.
I know, he's so wrong. And this is one of the things that is not satisfying and you can't put in a book. So they go back to the guy who, you know, why did they fail to catch him the first time they ran the print? Because it was several years between the first time they ran the print and the time they ran it again and caught him. And he set many fires in those years. And they could have stopped it if they just gotten it right the first time. And it turns out, you know, these are done by human matches, and the human made a mistake. But that's just not, you can't put that in a book because it's not narratively satisfying. Like, well, yeah, he just messed up. But he obviously feels terrible. You know, they do interviews with him and he's like, I don't know, I screwed up. And because when they brought it back to him a second time, he's like, oh yeah, this is Orr. But he just failed to catch it the first time. So the third one is a more modern story, and it is a story for our times. It takes place in Accomack County, Virginia. The fire started in 2012. And Accomack County, Virginia is on the East Coast, and it was at one point the richest rural county in all of America. They had a booming farm industry. It was a lovely vacation spot. They had like the Whispering Pines Motel, and people would come and stay there and enjoy the nice beaches and the beautiful countryside. But slowly, over 100 years, farming became more and more industrialized. And so the farms left. Now what's there are chicken processing plants. Tyson, Purdue. So if you live there, that's kind of what you do. You pluck chickens and process chickens and work at the Walmart. And you consider yourself lucky if you have a job, at least at this point, because it was after the crash of 2008 and 2009. And what happened is the people left. If you could, you left. And often you just got up and went, leaving behind an empty building or an empty business, empty houses, the Whispering Pines Motel, deserted. And this is how it was until somebody started burning them all down. They had 5 fires the first night that they were aware of. And they're like, okay, we definitely have an arsonist. And one of the things about having an arsonist in a small community like this is you know it's one of you. It's not some outsider passing through. It's somebody who lives here. So the cops knew that whoever they ended up arresting for this, it was going to be somebody they recognized and they knew. And the people all knew it too, like the citizens. And they started like accusing each other in the grocery store and patrolling with their guns at night. And, you know, neighbor against neighbor, who is it? Because just dozens of fires. It was up over 70. Meanwhile, though, it had another interesting effect, which is Oklahoma County, like many places in the United States, has a volunteer firefighting force. And one of the things that some people don't know about firefighters now is fire is a problem we've mostly solved. We still have fires, but the building codes have improved so much that 90% of calls that firefighters respond to now are EMS calls. They're coming to give emergency medical aid, not fight a fire. And so they sit around doing nothing a lot of the time. And especially in Oklahoma County, it was a bunch of young men playing video games. They're like playing Halo and doing nothing. And all of a sudden, they had a job. They felt useful. They're doing what they signed up to do. They were heroes. People brought them beer, free food. They fought fires, and they were fires, and they were devastating to the structures, including the Whispering Pines Motel burned down. But nobody was in them, so nobody was getting hurt, but there was the risk that somebody might. So we wanted to catch the person. But otherwise, they basically got to strut around like the young studs that they were, and were enjoying kind of, the excitement of having a mystery and a purpose. But the cops figured the way to catch this person was to stake out likely targets. So abandoned buildings, and wait to see if the arsonist showed up. So they were doing this one night when a gold minivan pulls up. Somebody gets out. They see the figure run across the field to an abandoned building. A few minutes later, figure runs back. Building starts smoking. And they said, aha, that's our guy. So they pursued the gold minivan. They pulled it over. And they arrest Good Time Charlie. Nobody would have expected Charlie Smith to be the arsonist. He was a kind of lovable loser type. He was like a little dumpy, but like a good guy. He had a drug habit off and on that prevented him from really going anywhere. He worked as a handyman and a mechanic. If your air conditioner broke down, like Charlie would fix it for you. If your car had a problem, Charlie would fix it for you. But he didn't really have a lot of romantic prospects. For one thing, like young people who were going places, they went. Like they got out. Charlie was stuck there. He didn't really have any prospects. Until one night, he's in the bar when one of the hottest numbers, Tanya Bundick, wants to talk to him. She wants to be his girlfriend. And she's Tanya, reasonably good looking, and for what passes as a catch. She's like heavy on the spray tan to the point where she's orange. But she's got a nice figure and a pretty face, and she's smart. She was one of the people who was gonna go places. She was gonna be a nurse, she was gonna get out, she have a good job. But then she had a couple of kids with a couple different guys, and one of them had special needs. So she had to drop out of school. And she started a secondhand children's clothing store for like fancy rich clothing that gets passed down when the kids don't need it anymore, and then the poor people can buy it secondhand. But then the recession hit, and people didn't even want the stuff secondhand. And so her business was failing. She didn't have any good relationships. And she met Charlie. And she says, I'm not gonna be with any loser. You can't be a druggie if you're gonna be with me. And he went and flushed his 8-ball down the toilet right in the bar. He's like, I will be clean for you. And for a while, it seemed like things were going pretty well. So and then fires. So they arrested Charlie. And he's like, yeah, all right, so I set the fires, but it wasn't my idea. And they said, well, what do you mean? And he says, well, it was Tanya's idea. So it turns out that Charlie, when he hit the lottery there and got his woman, that very time when he met her, he started experiencing problems in the bedroom. He could not perform. But he wanted to keep his woman. And the woman said, you know what I'd like you to do? And he said, I'll do anything for you, baby. She says, I'd like you to go burn down a building. And he said, what? And she says, yeah, that building down there that's empty, go burn it down. And he's like, ha, 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 yeah, right, Tanya. And she's like, no, 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 I'm serious. Go burn it down. And desperate to make his woman happy, he went, he came back, he's like, I did it, it's done. So Tanya goes over to the window, she's looking, no fire truck, no smoke. And she says, you didn't do it, did you? And he goes, no, I couldn't do it. And she says, never send a man to do a woman's job. You come with me. So she marched him down there and she set the fire, according to him. She did the next 17 of them. But then she was glimpsed at the scene, they thought, by a witness, and then he was afraid she would get, pinched. So he said he would take over doing the actual torch job. And that continued for the next, 76 fires, or however many there were. There were lots. So when they arrested Charlie, initially he took all the blame. And then they said, well, Tanya's out there boning some other guy now. And he's like, I will tell you all about her involvement. So the next thing you know, Tanya is also arrested. And they are both in jail now for a very long time. But what I thought is interesting, so every arson story has its own motive, its own reason for being. And this one is about a woman who had no control over her own life, or at least that's how it felt to her, that she was dealt one unfair card after another, and that she was stuck in this place that she desperately wanted to get out of, and she couldn't see a way out. So she took the only road she thought was available to her, and she burned it all down. So the last one is a little bit of a choose your own adventure. And you shall choose your adventure. So it's about two sisters, Sarah and Stevie Allman. They were living in Oakland. And Stevie was the older one, and she was kind of the aunt to Sarah's grasshopper. She was the hard worker, and she had spent many years working as like an assistant/accountant in this small business that then got bought by a bigger business, and they gave Stevie kind of an early golden parachute retirement. And so Stevie came into a lot of money, and she'd been very generous with her family. Sarah had a daughter named Muriel, who was now grown and living nearby. And Stevie had been helping out both Sarah, who lived with her, and Muriel, who lived nearby. And then she came into this big money. And so the family was maybe thinking, yeah, some of that's going to trickle our way. And then in her retirement, Stevie picked up a new hobby, which was harassing the local drug dealers. They were moving into the neighborhood and encroaching, and a place that had been nice and family friendly was kind of turning a little rough in Oakland. And so she was, snarking at them and telling them to go away and threatening to set up security cameras and catch them in the act, stuff like that. And then one day, Stevie comes running out of her home. It's on fire, and she's on fire, and she says, I've been firebombed. So, they come, they put out the fire, they take Stevie to the hospital, and she says, it's the drug dealers. That's who did this. So you, the investigators, have several options here. You can go and investigate the scene to find out more about this arson. You can go talk to Muriel. You can talk to Sarah, who was ostensibly also living in the home. You can go talk to the drug dealers, find out what their story is. What is your first move? Drug dealers? All right, so they round up some drug dealers. This is a big deal. Stevie was held up as a local hero. The governor of California put up a $60,000 reward for information leading to who had done this terrible thing to Stevie, thinking that she was, the victim of this terrible thing by the drug dealers. So they bring in the drug dealers, the Oakland police, and they start grilling them. So tell us about this big beef you have with Stevie. And the drug dealers say, who? Like, we heard you've been mixing it up with this red-headed woman, kind of, 50-something. She doesn't like you. And they're like, who? Eh? We have never heard of this Stevie person. I'm sorry. So they have nothing on the drug dealers but suspicion. What's your next move?
She did it herself.
That's what I think.
Well, how are you going to prove it? What do you do next?
Talk to her sister.
So Sarah, they go to talk to Sarah. She's missing. And they go back to Stevie, and they say, we can't find Sarah. And Stevie is very concerned. She's like, well, she was going to go to our cabin, maybe in Nevada. And there's no phone there, but maybe you can talk to her if you send some people. So Oakland calls up the Nevada police and say, can you go to this cabin and find Sarah? So they go to the cabin, no Sarah. Sarah's missing. Stevie's like, oh no, I'm afraid the drug dealers got her. And the drug dealers are busy like, who? But Sarah's missing. You can talk to her daughter, you can go back to the scene. What's your next move? Go talk to Muriel, the daughter. So they go to talk to the daughter, and she says, Mom and Aunt Stevie were kind of feuding lately because my mom had stolen some money from Stevie. And Stevie was threatening to cut her off. She says she was going to cut me off too, but I don't mind because I have a husband and a good job, and I understand why Stevie was upset with my mom. And it turns out Muriel has an alibi for the time of the firebombing. And she says, yeah, I don't know what happened to my mom. I haven't heard from her. You got one move left. Go back to the scene. All right, so you go back to the scene, and what you find is the fire point of origin is in one of the back bedrooms. Why is this weird?
They had to go through the house to get into the bedroom.
Exactly. So if you're drug dealers, you're good. Driving by, firebombing a house, you're going to hit the front of the house, right? You're not going to hit some back bedroom. So why would somebody set fire in a back bedroom in the house? What could be the motive?
I think someone was in there.
Yeah, trying to hide something, right? People set fire to crime scenes, so they think they're going to burn evidence. So now they start looking at this house a little differently. And they go through it again, and they find a body in the freezer. And it's a woman, and they're like, I think we found Sarah. So it's a woman, she's been in there a while. They take her to the morgue. They're trying to go back, they talk to Steve, they're like, we found your sister. She's kind of dead. Do you know anything about that? And she's like, what? She's dead? No, I don't know what you're talking about. This is the most horrible thing ever. I can't, nurse. So now they're thinking Stevie looks pretty good for it. When they get a phone call from a third sister. And the third sister, Leona, says, I'd like to report a missing person. And they said, how? I'm sorry, we know your sister, Sarah. And she goes, no, Stevie. And they said, what? There's like, Stevie's in the hospital. And she goes, no, that's Sarah. I haven't talked to Stevie in weeks. And they're like, what? I mean, their minds are like, oh, we don't even know what's going on. But yes, when they got the body thawed out and ID'd, it was Stevie in that freezer where she had been for weeks after Sarah murdered her, intending to cash in all those checks from the golden parachute. And she had attempted to feud with the drug dealers. They apparently saw her as some sort of gnat, and she did not register with them at all, so that failed. But she'd been impersonating Stevie for quite some time. And so she went to jail for a very long time. And that is one of the craziest stories I've ever heard. That concludes my talk. We are at 7:45. We have time for a couple questions if you have any about writing, where the series is going, arson, anything. Yes?
I wanted to know when the third...
Yes, the third one. So we spent months fighting about the title, the publisher and I, because this is one of the things some people don't know. The publisher decides, and they didn't like my title, which was The Neon Boneyard. And they said, we don't like it, because it's a cold case set in Vegas. In the third one, Reed and Ellery go to Vegas to solve his mother's murder. She was murdered when he was an infant. And he was adopted by a wealthy white Southern family. He's biracial. And his mother was Latina, and she was 19 and stabbed to death while he lay in his crib just a few feet away. And the case has been cold until at the end of No Mercy, he uncovers a shattering family secret that gives new life to the case. So he and Ellery set out west to see if he can figure it out after all these years. And I thought the Neon Boneyard was a pretty good title for such a case. And they're like, no. We want something more feminine. And I said, the girl in the Neon Boneyard. The pink Neon Boneyard. And they're like, no. How about we call it Snakeskin? And I'm like, what? First of all, that's more feminine. And second, no. I'm like, well, how about we call it Cold Case? And I'm like, well, it is a cold case, but why don't we just call it A Murder? That's the most generic title ever. So we went back and forth, and finally they took like my 26th suggestion, which is All the Best Lies. And that comes out in February 2020. And then I'm writing 4 now. Yes?
I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but there was a case, and I forget exactly what it was, regarding arson. It was happened to be an African-American male, where the FBI actually figured out where he did his marketing. And they put a device on all the plastic
The plastic bags. It was DC.
He was carrying
Yeah, he was putting them on porches.
Right.
Yep.
And lighting them on fire.
Yeah.
I thought that whole theory was really to think about. That one particular store.
Yeah, well, it was again, like the bag didn't go up.
Right.
So they were able, and it was an unusual bag.
Right.
And they had a bunch of different clues on this guy that ultimately, like his DNA was everywhere, and the DNA is what sunk him. It was on some clothes that he left at the scene, and it was on one of the bags that failed to go up. But yes, they put trackers on the bags. There were witnesses who saw him running off from the bag with one after placing one of the bags. But yes, it's DC.
Wow.
Crazy, right? There's some sick people out there. Anybody else?
So
Yeah. What?
you study these arsons, and that helped you come up with your, the arson in the book?
Yep, I mean, it was interesting to see the procedure of how they decide something's an arson, what the profile of an arsonist would be like. And yes, this helped me figure out, what to put in the book. As for my arson case. There's 2 in No Mercy. Ellery is chasing the old arson, which turns out also to involve Reed's boss, who was one of the investigators on the original case 25 years ago. And then also a serial rapist who's on the loose. So she's tackling both of them, getting into all kinds of trouble.
What percentage of arsonists are women? And when you said the woman was setting fires, I found that very, very odd.
It's pretty unusual. So here's the thing about arsonists. They estimate only 17% of them have been caught. So that's a pretty small minority, and thus what we know about them is based on the ones who get caught. So estimates vary, but they think around 90 to 95% of our people who set fires for fun, firebugs, are male. So Tanya was unusual. Yes, in the back. You had a question? No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. Go Bruins.